بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. وبعد, to continue inshallah with the Muhaddab min Ihya Ulumuddin by Abu Hamid Hujjatul Islam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala wa radi an. And we have reached the section on the etiquettes of recitation of the Quran في ظاهر آداب التلاوة. فقال الأول في حال القارئ. So now the author rahimahullah ta'ala, he's going to talk about the etiquettes of reciting the Quran, and this is something which is general and relevant to all of us, and he mentions the reasons behind them. And of course, just to remember that this is the abridged version, and so it's not going to be as detailed as the original version of Al-Ihya. So he says الأول في حال القارئ. So firstly, to look at the state of the reciter whilst reciting the Quran. He says, وَهُوَ أَن يَكُونَ عَلَى وُضُوء. Number one, the reciter should be in a state of ablution. So the person should be spiritually pure, i.e. they have performed their wudu. وَاقِعًا عَلَى هِيئَةِ الْأَدَبِ وَالسُّكُونِ. And they should be in a state of adab, i.e. A state of showing the respect that the Quran deserves, was-sukun, and likewise a state of tranquility, not agitated and moving around and so on and so forth. إِمَّا قَائِمًا وَإِمَّا جَالِسًا. Either standing or sitting. He says مُسْتَقْبِلَ الْقِبْلَةِ. And he should be facing the Qibla whilst reciting the Quran. And this is from the etiquettes. So not necessarily something which is wajib to face the Qibla, but it's better that a person does so. مستقبل القبلة. مطرقا رأسه. And he should be in a state of lowering his head. And it's not to lower it, with takalluf, where it's over the top, etc., and excessive, but rather it comes from the state of the heart being in a state of humbleness and humility in the presence of the word of Allah Azza wa Jal. غَيْرَ مُتَرَبِّعٍ وَلَا مُتَّكِئٍ. And he should not be cross-legged, nor should he be leaning whilst reciting the Quran. So, i.e. sitting up on his knees as it's more respectful, or leaning whilst reciting the Quran. And perhaps we can say that cross-leggedness is contextual. And so in our time today, it's not considered to be disrespectful to sit cross-legged. And for some, perhaps they can't sit on the flat of their legs for a long time without incurring pain in the knees and so on and so forth. And so sitting cross-legged is no problem. But there is an etiquette, and forgive me, brothers, for mentioning this, not to offend anyone, but there is something which we don't practice here in the western part of the world, which is practiced in the eastern part of the world, if you would like, and that is extending one's legs. It's considered to be incorrect to extend one's legs towards the Qibla. And if you were to go to some masajid in some countries, i.e. Muslim countries, predominantly Muslim countries, and you were to do that, they would be offended. And in fact, in the Prophet ﷺ's masjid, whilst I was there used to be an elderly Afghani man, and he used to come with a stick, and any young people he found extending their legs towards the Qibla, he would smack them on the legs. Not that we could do that here, and not to suggest that practice is something that we should be engaged in, but it was considered normal. The young person wouldn't say to the uncle, "What are you doing?" They'll quickly bring their legs in, tuck their legs in. And so extending our legs towards the Qibla should not be a practice that we engage in. Likewise, within certain Muslim cultures, it's also considered wrong to extend our legs to others such as our fathers, our mothers, our older siblings, and things like that. But again, contextual. And so here we may do so, and we don't mean it in a disrespectful way. Why? Because we haven't been raised in such a way. But in many Muslim countries, it's considered to be incorrect. And I attended a lesson where the teacher actually kicked the student out because they extended their legs in the class. Because it's considered to be aib. It's considered to be disrespectful within these circles of knowledge to extend one's legs. Contextually, that's not the case here. And so, as I said, it's not to offend anyone, but at the same time, it's amana. These are things that have to be conveyed. Why? Because perhaps one may go and study amongst the actual scholars and students of knowledge, and they've learned, so they know not to extend their legs. So he says, وَلَا جَالِسٌ عَلَى هَيْئَةِ التَّكَبُّرِ. Likewise, he should not be sitting in a state which is a state that resembles arrogance. And so again, contextual, what does sitting arrogantly mean? Perhaps, sitting back with your legs open, with a sense of pride. That should not be the case when listening to the Quran or reciting the Quran. He says, وَأَفْضَلُ الْأَحْوَالِ أَن يَقْرَأَ فِي الصَّلَاةِ قَائِمًا. And the best way to recite the Quran is to recite the Quran in salah while standing. Why does he specify standing? Because it's permissible to recite the Quran in salah while sitting. You can pray the voluntary prayer in a state of sitting. That's permissible. But the best way to recite the Quran is in salah while standing. He says, وَأَن يَكُونَ فِي الْمَسْجِدِ. And that this is performed in the masjid. Why? A sacred state in a sacred place for the recitation of sacred words. He says, فَذَلِكَ مِنْ أَفْضَلِ الْأَعْمَالِ. And that's from the best of ritual practices, i.e. actions of worship. And then he says, فَإِنْ قَرَأَ عَلَى غَيْرِ وُضُوءٍ وَكَانَ مُضْطَجِعًا فِي الْفَرَاشِ فَلَهُ أَيْضًا فَضْلٌ وَلَكِنَّهُ دُونَ ذَلِكَ. And he's going to give us the reason why. He says, if a person though were to recite, for example, على الفراش, whilst he's laying down, and he's perhaps he's in bed, or he's laying down on a sofa, or he's leaning and reciting, he said likewise that's still virtuous. It's not that one should not do so, but that's virtuous, but less than doing so whilst facing the Qibla, sitting, as we mentioned. So it's an etiquette, not something which is fard. And he says, even if he recited without being in a state of wudu. But here he's talking about reciting, not touching the mushaf. As for holding and touching the mushaf and turning the pages, a person must be in the state of ablution. But if they want to recite the Quran, it's recommended that they are in a state of ablution, but it's not a necessity. Except for the person who is in a state of janaba, their junub, meaning they have engaged in intimacy with the spouse. If a man or a woman has been intimate with their spouse, then they are not allowed to recite a portion of the Quran, even an ayah. It's not allowed. What is allowed is adhkar. And so if you are reciting your adhkar, for example, before going to sleep, and a part of that happens to be from the Quran, that's fine. But you are not allowed to recite the Quran, as the ulama state. And so he says, الذين, he mentions the ayah, قال الله تعالى الذين يذكرون الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبهم ويتفكرون في خلق السماوات والأرض. Those that they remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala while standing, while sitting, and whilst on their sides. And they reflect and contemplate over the creation of Allah Azza wa Jal. And that's something we don't engage in the cities, unfortunately. We don't reflect over the creation of Allah. Why? Because we're surrounded by concrete jungles. So he uses the ayah to show that it's permissible to recite standing, to recite sitting, and to recite laying down. But the best form of recitation is in the salah. And then he says, فَأَثْنَى عَلَى الْكُلِّ وَلَكِنْ قَدَّمَ الْقِيَامَ فِي الذِّكْرِ ثُمَّ الْقُعُودَ ثُمَّ الذِّكْرَ مُضْطَجِعًا. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praises all who remember Him, whether standing, sitting, or laying down. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives preference, i.e. puts first those who are standing, and then those who are sitting, and then those who are laying down. Then he says, الثاني. So the second etiquette of recitation, or the second point when it comes to recitation of the Quran, في مقدار القراءة, the amount that one should recite regularly. He says, وللقراء عادات مختلفة في الاستكثار والاختصار وأولى ما يرجع إليه في التقديرات قول رسول الله عليه الصلاة والسلام من قرأ القرآن في أقل من 3 لم يفقهه. So he says there are various approaches of the Qur'an, the reciters of the Quran, when it comes to dividing the Quran up over days. And the best of ways is to refer back to the master of creation, the Prophet ﷺ, and to follow in that which he has stated. And he said, the one who reads the Quran in less than 3 days will not have any understanding of it. I.e., the Prophet ﷺ is telling us not to be too hasty. He says, وَذَلِكَ لِأَنَّ زِيَادَةَ عَلَيْهِ تَمْنَعَهُ التَّرْتِيلِ. He says, because if you were to recite the Quran in less than 3 days, you will not be able to recite it properly. I.e., if you try to recite more than 10 ajza a day, you will not be able to recite the Quran with proper tartil, tajweed and makharij, etc. He says, وأمر النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام عبد الله بن عمرو رضي الله عنهما أن يختم القرآن في كل سبع. And the Prophet ﷺ, he instructed the son of Amr ibn al-As, Abdullah, to recite the Quran every 7 days. I.e., to finish the Quran every 7 days. And that's a practice of many of the ulama, to finish the Quran once a week. And we'll speak about it in context, i.e. in relation to our context shortly. وكذلك كان جماعة من الصحابة رضي الله تعالى عنهم يختمون القرآن في كل جمعة. Likewise, there was a group of the companions who would complete the Quran every Jum'ah, i.e. they would end the Quran on every Friday. So they would start perhaps on the Saturday and they would complete their portion on the Friday. Not together as a group, meaning there were some here, some there, etc. Individuals. كعثمان وزيد بن ثابت وابن مسعود وأبي بن كعب رضي الله عنهم. So Uthman ibn Affan and Zayd ibn Thabit ibn Mas'ud رضي الله تعالى عنهم, Ubay ibn Ka'ab, they used to recite the Quran every 7 days and they would complete the recitation on a Friday. And then he says, الثالث الترتيل. So before we come to الترتيل, how much or how often should a person recite the Quran? And this is the discussion we had last week, I believe. What's the answer? How much of the Quran should I be reciting every day? I guess I gave 6 pages. So I gave the answer away. I said, how much should a person be reciting? Then I said, every day. So the answer is, every day I should recite something of the Quran. And didn't you say last week half the Quran? Huh? So every day I should recite a portion of the Quran. The bare minimum I should recite is what?
1 page.
Huh? 4 pages? 1 page, bare minimum? Yeah, the bare minimum is whatever you are able to recite. Why? Because if a person has just started to recite the Quran, they've just learned how to recite the Quran, it might take them 20 minutes to recite one verse. For them to recite Alif, Lam, Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. That might take them 20 minutes initially. And if it does, Alhamdulillah. Whereas for someone else, in 20 minutes, they can recite half a chapter of the Quran, half a juz. And so it depends on your ability. But you should not make excuses for yourself and say, I don't have time for the Quran. Allahu Akbar. If you don't have time for the Quran, what do you have time for in your life? And the Quran, when you read the Quran, if you have a daily relationship with the Quran, tried and tested, generation after generation, you will find the barakah in your life. You will find barakah in your life, in your provision, in your health, in your children, in your spouse. Everything in your life, you will find the barakah of the Quran if you develop a relationship with it. And the aim should be, I get to the place where as a minimum, I am reciting how much of the Quran a day? What the standard. I want to get to the place where I am able to, as a bare minimum, recite how much of the Quran a day? A juz. So I should aim to get to the place where I'm reciting a juz of the Quran per day. That should be my aim. And that will take between 30 to 40 minutes. If I recite with tartil, between 30 to 40 minutes. Tartil meaning not extremely slowly, not like Shaykh al-Husari or al-Minshawi, but reciting at a medium pace where you're giving the Quran its due right of recitation, 30 to 40 minutes a day, and you can finish 1 juz of the Quran. And that should be the aim, to develop that relationship. Now, if I am at a place where it takes me 10 minutes to read half a page, no problem, I start there. And my aim should be, I get to that place where I'm reading 1 juz per day. It might be in a few years' time, but every single day I'm reading the Quran. And if we would like our children to have a relationship with the Quran, what do we need to do?
You have to start with them.
We have to be the example. We have to have a relationship with the Quran in front of our children. If I'm sitting at home in front of my children and the only relationship that they see is my phone, my eyes are stuck to my phone all day, then what are they going to develop as they grow up? They're going to develop a similar relationship. But if they see that every single day I'm reading the Quran, they see me reading the Quran every single day, that's going to become something that they, inshallah bi'ithnillah, will also practice. It becomes a norm to them. I've normalized that practice with them. Likewise, especially now in the winter period, fasting, Mondays and Thursdays, and making sure that my family know that I'm fasting. Of course, the argument will be, no, but we should keep certain things for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. Yes, but when it comes to being a role model, we let them know so that they follow us, inshallah bi'ithnillah. So our children, breaking our fast in front of them, it doesn't mean that you have to go around the house, I'm fasting, everyone, look at me, etc. No, it might be at iftar time, you get some dates, you get some water, and your children will say, what are you doing? You say, I'm breaking my fast. Why? On Mondays and Thursdays, it's sunnah to fast. Why? So that when they grow up, they remember that, and that becomes a habit for them. So the aim should be for every person to get to that place one day, bi'ithnillah, if they're not already there, where they can recite one juz of the Quran every single day. And I guarantee you will see the results in your life. And many of us, nowadays, people are paying to go to therapists, to go to counselors, we go to the doctors, we will read self-help books and so on and so forth, looking for cures. But we don't give the Quran its time. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? شِفَاءٌ لِمَا فِي الصُّدُورِ. It's a cure for that which is in the chests, for that which is in the hearts. Read the Quran and see for yourself. Read it and see for yourself. One juz per day as a minimum. And there are some, mashallah, they recite the Quran every 3 days. There are some, they recite multiple ajza of the Quran daily, etc. And once you become accustomed to the Quran, it's not difficult to recite regularly. For example, you can recite whilst you're driving. You can recite whilst you're sitting on a bus. Keep a mushaf with you, or the mushaf on the phone. Recite on the bus, recite on the train. And don't be shy to recite. It doesn't mean you have to do it very loud, but do it loud enough that perhaps someone sitting in front of you might hear a little bit. It's da'wah at the same time. Don't be shy to have a relationship with the Quran no matter where you are. You're waiting in a hospital, pull out the mushaf. You're waiting for an appointment, pull out the mushaf. Use the time that we have to visit our companion, the Quran. So then he says, الثالث الترتيل. The third etiquette to be discussed and considered is a tartil. And what is a tartil? A tartil is basically reciting the Quran correctly by giving the Quran the rules of tajweed which should be applied, and likewise the makharij, the pronunciation of the letters in the correct manner to the best of our ability. To the best of our ability. He says, هو المستحب في هيئة القرآن لأن المقصود من القراءة التفكر والترتيل معين عليه. He says that this is mustahab, it's recommended, although there's khilaf, of course, about whether it's mustahab, whether it's wajib, whether it's fard. Unless he's talking about a tartil, meaning you're going above and beyond the tartil that is wajib, the qira'ah, ada'u tajweed and so on and so forth. He says why? Because the point behind reciting the Quran is what? Is to reflect and to consider and to receive instruction from Allah Azza wa Jal. And when you recite with tartil, it aids you in doing so. But there is a barrier for some of us, even if we recite with tartil. What's the barrier? The language. And that shows the importance of learning the Arabic language. And if you have the time, and I believe everyone has the time, put the effort in to learn the Arabic language. Put the effort in. Today, many of us, we spend hours watching TV shows or films, or playing computer games, or talking idly, or playing games on phones, or scrolling on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or whatever it might be. Hours we spend. Take half an hour and place it towards learning the Arabic language. Half an hour daily. And within a few months, you will see the results. And no person can say, I'm not able to learn, I'm not a good learner, etc. No, Allah has given every person the capacity to learn. It's just that we learn in different ways and in different times. We all speak at least a language here. Therefore, we're able to learn another language. And so, if a person passes away without having understood the Quran, it's a great shame and a great loss. And there is a line of poetry. I believe Al-Mutanabbi, he says, ما رأيت نقص كنقص القادر على التمام. He says, I have not seen deficiency like the deficiency of the one who is able to be complete. You have someone who is able to be complete. They have the intelligence, they have the ability, but they are deficient. Why? Because they don't use what Allah has given them. He says, I haven't seen a deficiency such as his deficiency. It's shameful when you see a person and you know this person has talent, but they don't use it. It's worse than a person who has no talent and doesn't work. The one who has talent but doesn't work hard is worse than the one who has no talent but also doesn't work hard. Why? Because the one who has talent, if he were to work hard, he could do great things. And so likewise, all of us, there are so many mediums to learn the language today and to learn the Quran today. So many free apps. There are, subhanallah, if you go on YouTube, there are non-Muslims that learn the Arabic language and speak the Arabic language out of interest. Imagine. We as Muslims, we don't give the time to the language of our deen and to the language of Al-Quran, yet there are non-Muslims who are learning it for fun. It's a shame on us. And there are so many free resources to learn the Arabic language today. You don't even need to pay a penny. Go online and see for yourself. He says, ولذلك نعتت أم سلمة رضي الله عنها قراءة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فإذا هي تنعت قراءة مفسرة حرفا. So Salama رضي الله تعالى عنها, she described the recitation of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام when reciting the Quran, and she described a recitation that was it was as if it was being explained when he recited it, letter by letter, because of the time that the Prophet ﷺ gave to his recitation. وقال ابن عباس رضي الله عنه لأن أقرأ البقرة وآل عمران وأرتلهما وأتدبرهما أحب إلي من أن أقرأ القرآن هذرمة. Ibn Abbas رضي الله عنه, he said, if I were to recite Al-Baqarah and Al Imran, and I were to recite them in a pace which allows me to reflect over their meanings, that is more beloved to me than reciting the entire Quran in a hasty manner. Why? Because of the purpose behind the recitation is what? To reflect. وسئل مجاهد عن رجلين دخل في الصلاة فكان قيامهما واحدا إلا أن أحدهما قرأ البقرة فقط والآخر القرآن كله فقال هما في الأجر سواء. So Mujahid, one of the students of Ibn Abbas, one of the tabi'een, and known for his statements in tafsir, he was asked about two men who entered into the masjid, and one recited in his salah the entire Quran, and the other recited in his Quran Al-Baqarah only, but they stood for the same amount of time. So the time that it took for one man to recite the entire Quran is the same amount of time it took for the other man to recite just Al-Baqarah, meaning he recited it slowly and he recited it fast. He said they have the same reward as each other, the same reward. There is no extra reward in reciting the Quran in its entirety in a fast manner, when compared to reciting Al-Baqarah in a slow manner to reflect over the meanings, which goes back to what we were saying earlier. Even if a person recites one verse and it takes 20 minutes, no problem to start off with. And then he says Ar-Rabi', but just to perhaps to elaborate slightly, when we say reading one juz of the Quran daily should be the goal as a minimum, it's to keep a relationship with the Quran for the barakah, not only for the reflection and for the tadabbur that is being referred to here. Why? Because this is for those who firstly understand the Arabic language and those who have the ability to reflect properly and correctly, perhaps you could say. But if a person is able to get to that level where they're able to reflect over the meanings of the Quran when reciting, alhamdulillah, as long as they do not start spreading their reflections and informing others of their reflections, etc. Why? Because they're not qualified to do so. And there is a way that we can reflect, as we spoke about last week when reciting the Quran. I ask myself, where am I from this verse? When I come to the verses that relate to the description of paradise, I say, oh Allah, grant me paradise. When it comes to the verses that relate to the description of hellfire, I say, oh Allah, protect me from the hellfire, and so on and so forth. He says, وَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ التَّرْتِيلَ مُسْتَحَبٌ لَا لِمُجَرِّدِ التَّدَبُّرِ وَالتُّؤْدَةُ بل لأن ذلك أقرب إلى التوقير والاحترام وأشد تأثيرا في القلب من الاستعجال. He says, and know that at-tartil, so reciting in this manner, is recommended, mustahab, not simply for the sake of reflecting and for the sake of tranquility, etc., but because that is closer to showing respect to the Quran. When you recite slowly and you give the Quran its due time, it's closer to being respectful and glorifying the Quran in the manner that you're sitting with it. And likewise, so for example, another point to make that perhaps Imam Ghazali is going to mention it later, but just in case, when we are reciting the Quran, we should give the Quran our full concentration. And so if I have the Quran on my phone, I should not be going from the Quran to other apps and interrupting my recitation of the Quran to go to WhatsApp or to go to social media or to go to the internet, etc. No, I should be fully focused on the Quran, the amount that I'm going to read until I complete it. So if I'm reading one juz and I want to do it all at once, I don't stop until I finish it. Or if I'm going to break it up through the day, for example, I'm going to read a quarter of a juz in the morning, a quarter in the afternoon, a quarter in the evening, and a quarter at night, then I make sure I read the quarter without interruption, etc. Then he says, الرابع البكاء. So the fourth etiquette you have with the Quran is the ability to cry. He says, البكاء مستحب مع القراءة, that it is recommended that one cries whilst recitation. وإنما طريق البكاء أن يحضر قلبه الحزن فمن الحزن ينشأ البكاء ووجه إحضار الحزن أن يتأمل ما فيه من التهديد والوعيد والمواثيق والعهود. He says, and the way that a person will acquire the ability to cry whilst reciting the Quran is that sadness and grief can be found present in his heart whilst reciting the Quran. He says, and as for how to present the sadness and grief to your heart, how to bring this into your heart whilst reciting, he says it is to reflect over the consequences, the punishments, the agreements and the covenants that we have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so, for example, if I were to deeply reflect over the punishments mentioned in the Quran, that would make me feel quite sad, especially if I assume I may be from one of those going to be punished, etc. If I reflect over the amount of times I've broken my agreement with Allah Azza wa Jal, where I haven't fulfilled that which I should be fulfilling, and so on and so forth, I will start to feel sad and broken. And so he's saying that a person should try to bring this into the heart whilst reciting the Quran. He says, ثم يتأمل تقصيره في أوامره وزواجره فيحزن لا محالة ويبكي. He says, and then he reflects over his deficiencies in following the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and staying away from that which Allah has commanded us to stay away from, and he will begin to feel that sadness and grief, and he will cry. فإن لم يحضره حزن وبكاء. What if he is unable to feel that sadness and he is unable to cry? He says, فَلْيَبْكِ عَلَى فَقْدِ الْحُزْنِ وَالْبُكَاءِ فَإِنَّ ذَلِكَ أَعْظَمُ الْمَصَائِبِ. He says that let him cry at his lack of ability to feel that grief and that sadness and to shed a tear whilst reciting the Quran. Why? Because that's from the greatest of calamities. Meaning, the heart is not as alive as it should be. And this is one of the problems of our time. The heart is overstimulated. Because imagine for us, when we read about the ayat of Jahannam and Jannah, etc., we've seen so many images that we're desensitized, our imaginations are not as strong, our hearts are not as reflective as the earlier generations used to be. Perhaps they would see one image in their lifetime. But today, how many images do we see all the time? Our minds are constantly being stimulated. And so a person will find it difficult to reflect over the Quran because we are overstimulated, always plugged in. Headphones, iPhones, if you want to call them that. Literally, they're called an iPhone, subhanAllah. But the screen, where your eyes are connected to the screen all the time. Ears are connected to sound all the time. Your mind is constantly being stimulated. So there's no time to reflect. There's no time to feel that grief, to feel that sadness, to reflect over our state. We don't go out into the wilderness. We don't see the stars. We don't see the creation. And so we lack that feeling of being overwhelmed by the creation of Allah. That feeling of insignificance when we look at ourselves and we look at the grandness of Allah's creation. We don't have that because we are overstimulated, living in concrete jungles, etc. And so he's saying, if you cannot cry due to sadness, cry because of your lack of ability to feel sad. And then he says, Al-Khamis, and we'll conclude with this one for the evening, inshallah. He says, أَن يُرَاعِيَ حَقَّ الْآيَاتِ, that a person gives the verses that he is reciting their due. فَإِذَا مَرَّ بِآيَةِ سَجْدَةٍ سَجَدٍ. And so if he recites an ayah which requires sujood, ayat sujood, then he engages in sujood, he prostrates. وَكَذَلِكَ إِذَا سَمِعَ مِنْ غَيْرِهِ سَجْدَةً سَجَدَ إِذَا سَجَدَ التَّالِي. Likewise, if he's sitting and he hears an ayah of sujood being recited by someone close to him, and the one who recited it prostrates, then he should also prostrate. وَلَا يَسْجُدْ إِلَّا إِذَا كَانَ عَلَى طَهَارَةٍ. And he should not prostrate unless he is in a state of tahara, i.e. wudu. وَأَقَلُّهُ أَن يَسْجُدَ بِوَضْعِ جَبْهَتِهِ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ. And the bare minimum that a person should do is that they should prostrate with the forehead on the ground. وأكمله أن يكبر فيسجد ويدعو في سجوده بما يليق بالآية التي قرأها. And the ideal form of prostration is that a person he engages in takbir, Allahu Akbar, and then he prostrates, and whilst in prostration he supplicates to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala about that which is related to the verse that he has read. So for example, if he's reading about those who refuse to bow with those who bow, then he should ask Allah, oh Allah, make me from the raki'een. Oh Allah, thabbitni ala deen, and so on and so forth. He says, وَيُشْتَرَطُ فِي هَذِهِ السَّجْدَةِ شُرُوطُ الصَّلَاةِ مِنْ سَتْرِ الْعَوْرَةِ وَاسْتِقْبَالِ الْقِبْلَةِ وَالطَّهَارَةِ. And it is conditional for this sujood, that which is conditional for the salah. So in the salah, I have to have my awrah covered. I have to face the qibla. I have to be in a state of tahara. Likewise, for the sujood of sajda, I have to be in the same state. And then he comes to as-sadis, أن يقول في مبتدأ قراءته. When starting, he's going to go into that, inshallah, bi-idhnillah, and we will continue from there, bi-idhnillah, next week. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد.